The Florida night was still. A December chill lingered over the swamplands, the kind of quiet that amplifies the smallest sounds, the rustle of palm fronds, the distant croak of a frog, or the metallic click of a shotgun being loaded. Inside a modest rural home near Osprey, Sarasota County, a young family prepared for what should have been an ordinary evening. They would never live to see another sunrise. By the next morning, a ranch hand named Don McLeod would push open their door, only to stumble into one of the most haunting crime scenes Florida has ever known. 4 lives extinguished, a wife and mother beaten, violated, and murdered, a husband shot where he stood. 2 small children, one just 3 years old, the other not even 2, executed in cold blood. The crime shocked the community, but it didn't stop there. It became one of the most enduring mysteries in American true crime history, a case so twisted that decades later investigators would dig up the graves of 2 infamous killers, men who had already been immortalized in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, in a desperate bid for answers. This is the story of the Walker family murders. And if you want more real crime stories told in full detail, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. The Walkers lived simply. Their small home was tucked away in a rural stretch of Sarasota County. To neighbors, it was a quiet picture of young family life. Cliff Walker, just 24 years old, working the ranch and providing for his wife, Christine. She was also 24, warm, pretty, with a reputation for being kind-hearted. Their children, Jimmy, age 3, and Debbie, just shy of her 2nd birthday, filled their home with the sounds of laughter, babbling words, and the endless noise of toddlerhood. But in the span of just a few hours, their world would collapse into violence. On the night of December 19th, 1959, someone came into that home, or perhaps was invited in. What happened over the next few hours was so brutal, so methodical, that law enforcement would struggle for decades to understand who could have done it and why. At dawn the next morning, December 20th, a friend of Cliff's named Don McLeod arrived. The plan was to go hog hunting, something the men did often. When Don walked up to the Walker home, something felt wrong. The stillness was too absolute. He knocked. No answer. He entered. Inside, he stumbled into a nightmare. Christine lay lifeless, her body showing signs of a violent struggle. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot. Cliff was nearby, also shot, his cowboy toughness no match for the cold calculation of a firearm. And then the children, 3-year-old Jimmy, dead from a bullet wound, and 23-month-old Debbie, still in the bathtub, her small body face down in a few inches of water, also shot. The water had turned dark around her. The sight was enough to shake even the most hardened man. McLeod rushed out, and the call went to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. Within hours, the home was crawling with deputies and investigators. But what they found would raise more questions than answers. The Walker house wasn't just a murder scene, it was a puzzle. On the floor, a bloody cowboy boot, seemingly out of place. On a table, the torn cellophane wrapper of a cool cigarette pack. On the bathtub faucet, a clear, latent fingerprint, too sharp to be accidental. These details suggested the killer, or killers, hadn't been careful. They had left evidence, but whether that evidence would ever lead to justice was another matter. As the investigators began piecing together the timeline, one fact stood out. Christine was likely the first to arrive home. She may have let someone inside, perhaps someone she knew. Cliff and the children arrived later, only to walk into a scene already spiraling out of control. The brutality pointed to rage, but the precision, the execution-style shootings of the children, hinted at cold, deliberate malice. At the same time, halfway across the country, America was reeling from another horrific murder. Just a month earlier, in November of 1959, a family of 4, the Clutters of Holcomb, Kansas, had been killed in a strikingly similar way. That crime would later become world-famous thanks to Capote's In Cold Blood. The tragedy of the Walker murders isn't just about how they died, it's about who they were when they lived. To truly understand the weight of this crime, we need to step back and see the Walkers not as names in a police file, but as a young family full of promise, love, and ordinary joys. Evelyn Christine. Christine Walker was just 24 years old. To most who knew her, she was sunshine wrapped in a quiet smile. Neighbors described her as gentle, kind, and devoted to her children. Christine grew up in Florida, surrounded by the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew each other. By the late 1950s, she had settled into life as a young wife and mother. She kept house, tended to her babies, and waited for her husband Cliff to come home from long days of ranch work. But Christine wasn't just a homemaker. She was also vibrant, lively, and in the prime of her youth. Friends would later say she was the kind of person who lit up a room, someone who carried herself with quiet strength. She had dreams for her children, and like many young mothers of that time, she was fiercely protective of them. Which is why what happened to her inside that little house felt so personal, so cruel, so utterly out of place in the life of a woman who wanted nothing more than to raise her family in peace. The morning of December 20th, 1959, Sarasota County Sheriff's deputies flooded the Walker home. The little house that had been filled with children's laughter just a day before was now silent, except for the steady shuffle of boots, the snap of camera shutters, and the low murmurs of investigators who had never seen anything like this. The brutal murder of a family of 4 was unheard of in Sarasota County. Detectives knew immediately this wasn't just another case, it was going to haunt them. The evidence spoke volumes, but it was messy. A bloody cowboy boot, a cool cigarette wrapper, a fingerprint on the faucet. These weren't the calling cards of a careful, methodical killer. They were mistakes. Clues left behind. But in 1959, forensics was limited. DNA wasn't even a concept in law enforcement yet. Detectives had to rely on fingerprints, witness accounts, and intuition. The first man to fall under the shadow of suspicion was Don McLeod, the very friend who discovered the bodies. Investigators had to rule him out. He was the last person to see Cliff alive and the first person at the crime scene. But McLeod cooperated fully, and nothing linked him to the crime. Then whispers turned toward another man, Wilbur Bill Tucker, a neighbor. Tucker had a reputation for paying too much attention to Christine. Some accounts suggested he had made advances toward her, though she had never reciprocated. In most true crime stories, the horror eventually gives way to a courtroom. A suspect is charged, evidence is laid out, and a jury decides their fate. But in the case of the Walker family, that day never came. Despite mountains of evidence, multiple suspects, and decades of investigation, no one has ever stood trial for the murders of Cliff, Christine, Jimmy, and Debbie Walker. The murders of Christine, Cliff, Jimmy, and Debbie Walker didn't just end a family, they scarred an entire community. Sarasota County in 1959 was still a quiet, rural place. People left their doors unlocked, children played outside until dark, and neighbors trusted one another. After the Walkers were killed, that innocence evaporated overnight. The Walkers' story became a whispered warning. If it could happen to them, it could happen to us. Neighbors who had once lived without fear began locking their doors. Parents watched their children more closely. Even decades later, longtime residents of Osprey remembered the case not just as a tragedy, but as the moment their community changed forever. Church services were filled with grief. Families gathered for funerals that should never have been needed. 4 caskets stood side by side, too small, too large. A young couple, their toddler son, and their infant daughter laid to rest together. It was a sight few could ever forget. Unlike many crimes of the era, the Walker murders didn't fade into the background of history. They refused to be forgotten. Every few years, the case resurfaced in headlines, whether because of new suspects, advances in forensic science, or renewed public interest. Each time, people hoped the mystery would finally be solved. Each time, hope slipped away. By the 1980s and 1990s, when DNA testing first became available, investigators held out hope that science could answer what human memory could not. and for a moment it looked possible. But every round of testing led only to more questions. The link to the Clutter murders and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood ensured the Walkers' story would remain in the national spotlight. Even though Hickok and Smith were executed in 1965 for their Kansas crimes, their specter lingered over the Florida case. When their bodies were exhumed in 2012, it made national news. For a brief moment it seemed the Walkers might finally find justice. But the DNA results offered no resolution. Instead, the case grew even murkier. To this day, the debate continues: were the Walkers killed by two already notorious men, or by someone closer to home, someone who lived in their own community? The discovery of mixed DNA in 2019 added another disturbing layer. At least two contributors were identified, one male, one female. If accurate, it means the murders may not have been the work of a lone predator, but of multiple attackers. Could a woman really have taken part in such a crime? Or was it possible contamination from decades of handling the evidence? The questions remain unanswered. In 2023, investigators took the extraordinary step of exhuming the Walkers themselves. The goal was to better separate Christine's DNA from the mixtures and perhaps identify the foreign profiles more clearly. It was a grim but necessary step in a case where time has become the greatest enemy. Biological evidence deteriorates with each passing year. Witnesses die, memories fade. Yet hope lingers that technology may succeed where human effort has failed. More than 65 years later, the Walker murders remain officially unsolved. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office keeps the case open, refusing to close the file. The Florida Sheriff's Association highlighted it again as recently as March 2025, underscoring how determined law enforcement remains to find the truth. More than 65 years later, the Walker family murders remain one of America's most haunting, unsolved cases. Do you think Perry Smith and Richard Hickok killed the Walkers? Or was the killer someone else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments.